And okay, all right. So we're in business. So this is day 3 of our continuing story between Britain and Afghanistan, and we'll wrap it up and with I don't know, going up to the modern day type of thing, and hopefully at least at your leisure, read the article about the recent withdrawal article that I sent you from Atlantic. It's a rather long article, but you have a whole month you can to read it, so to speak. But it'll be interesting to see if anybody has had chance to browse through it. And it was amazing story as to how it was almost like Vietnam deja vu all over again. So, but anyway, but we're digressing. So, but I just thought that might be very appropriate for this time. Now we're somewhere we're talking about the second Brit-Afghan war as to, and that by this time, Afghanistan had formed as a country. They lost this thing, and the emirs, that those Muhammad, who was not Britain's favorite guy, who was took uh, power as the emir, and his grandsons, after some infighting in the families, were the rulers. And the guy who was ruling, we stopped somewhere around 1879 when the Brits had the Darbar, or the big Mughal court, and at the same time the famine, just to refresh your memory. And this chap was actually in the earlier part, he was in the Russian part of Russian Asia, Uzbekistan, in that area. So he was more attuned to the Russian things, and he wanted to be, just be between these two giants, and he wanted to get the best of both worlds. So as you can see from this cartoon that I've showed you again, he's caught between the bear and the British lion. And he was for Afghanistan, he was a reasonably forward-looking ruler rather, not a lawyer. And he tried to impose some regular military reforms and institute at post office, and tried to bring back
What does one take
Afghanistan.
antibiotics for?
Yeah. Okay, let's see. I think I have to mute somebody. Okay. Okay, I think if you haven't forgotten, I'll mute a couple of people's mics are open. So okay, I think Jay's mic was open. Okay, all right. So he did, and he tried to unify, impose the Pashto language, and so he was, and at the same time, then again, the Brits were again getting the vibes about that he's more leaning towards Russia, so they sent him a letter, as I talked about last time, that okay, well, I think better decide which side you want to lean on. So, and he dragged his feet, and so finally the Brits by that time were fairly powerful. They controlled all of India. They had just successfully put down the rebellion, and they wanted to make sure that the Russians, so finally they sent him an ultimatum, so to speak, and decided, okay, it's time for another jolly good war. So this was the start of the second Brit-Afghan war. Okay, let's see. And on the British side, the two characters were the guy on the Afghan side. Now, I think if the two Brits in our class, would remember that this man is a this thing in British military history or school history. Every British boy learns about the General Frederick Roberts' march from Kabul to Kandahar. And because they marched initially, obviously they won quite a few of the battles, except for the one that plays big into Afghan history and in popular history as well. We'll talk about. And and this is his statue in Calcutta, as well as in Britain. So he fought in many wars. I mean, you have to say that he was a British Irish man, born in a military family in India, and arose through the ranks and fought during the 1857 rebellion or mutiny, and then made his big name in the second Afghan war. And he did get around. He fought in what was at that time known as Abyssinia, I don't know what Brits were doing in Abyssinia, but that's another story. I would have to, really look that up. And then he also fought in Boer War, First World War, and arose to the rank of a field marshal during the First World War. So he's an amazing uh, person in the British military history. It's almost not quite, but almost rising to the level of Nelson and Wellington for the late 19th and early 20th century. Okay, and the biggest thing that he is remembered for is that during the heat of summer in July, he was able to take his army of 10,000 troops 300 miles across rough terrain from Kabul to Kandahar, which is, in the southern Afghanistan. So that is the Battle of Kandahar that he's remembered for. And this was the famous battle that was the one battle that the Brits lost. And this was the reason why he had to march from north to south. This was one battle that the son of Sher Ali Khan, named Ayub Khan, was gave the Blitz a bloody nose. And Battle of Mewad is plays high in the Afghan history. There was one time where they actually, even though they had lesser quality of weapons, they were able to defeat the Brits. And so this has been memorized by Rudyard Kipling. And interestingly, this was the time of, I don't have her picture because this was the time of Afghan Joan of Arc, a woman named Malala. The name may sound familiar, that she was an 18-year-old girl because the Afghans were actually ready to give up, being outgunned, and she inspired the Afghan soldiers by reciting this soliloquy or poem. Young love, if you do not fall in the battle, by God, someone is saving you as a token of shame. And that's a long Janjaweed Pashto language, but I don't think any of us are familiar with Pashto. So, but it's just so she's the big hero in Afghanistan, and even under the present day, she's still fondly remembered as, and even the current Taliban people just glorify her bravery at that time. So they had defeated, that won most of the battle, but this was one battle that plays long. And General Roberts, I just put this slide last night. So this was just, as there's nothing to do with this thing, but these are the honors. The Brits were big into giving honors, so these are the titles that General Roberts were bestowed upon. We see Victoria Cross, Knight of Garter, Order of St. Patrick, Grand Commander of Bath, Order of Merit, a Knight Grand Commander of India, an Eminent Order of Indian Empire. So these are all, and this reminded me of a joke from my favorite British television series talking about honors. Bernard Woolley is the secretary to the Prime Minister, James, who's played by this actor named James Hacker. It says, of course, in the service, CMG stands for Call Me God, KCMG stands for Kindly God. What is it? Minister is baffled. He's asked, what does GCMG stand for? Even God calls me God. So that has nothing to do with it, but that just thought it was a nice way about titles. And the Brits actually kept all the Indian princes and Nawabs, happy by giving all sorts of titles, so that was a big this thing about giving honors, type of thing. So it shows us to how to appeal to people's vanity. Okay, and this you may be familiar, all of you are familiar with this, and this was an interesting tie-in with as to how when first time Dr. Watson meets Sherlock Holmes, he refers to the Battle of Mewad, that we alluded to earlier. You can see in the fourth line. You can read it for yourself, but say, I've served in the fatal Battle of Mewad. I was struck in the shoulder. This is the Afghan rifles, the old-fashioned rifles, which is shattered my subclavian artery. And this was, again, as we talked about, that the Islamic fundamentalism had already risen in 1840s, even before the Indian Mutiny. So, and that the whole idea had transferred. And these were the Ghazis were the rather, I know, even if they caught no fear of death, they would fight until the end, even though they're outnumbered and outgunned, they would come upon waves. So that's why the Ghazis were, and actually this was like the Japanese kamikaze. So he was saved by his uh, assistant, Murray, orderly rather. And so this is so. So this was the way. So, and and then finally it just goes. The story goes as to how did Sherlock figure this out? Here's a gentleman of the medical type with an air of military man, clearly an army doctor. Then he had just come from the tropics because his face is dark, but that's not the natural tint of his skin. But his wrists are fair. He's undergone hardship and sickness, as his haggard face clearly shows. His left arm has been injured. He holds it stiff. Where in the tropics could an English army doctor who would have seen so much hardship? Clearly, Afghanistan. So that's how he explains it. Okay, well, the mystery solved. So this was a study of Scarlet, the first novel by Arthur Conan Doyle. Okay. And finally, after the Amir, he got injured and died of gangrene or something. And his son finally decided that, okay, well, the Brit side is more rewarding. So he became a British protectorate and finally gave Brits, they negotiated the treaty. And obviously he was rewarded handsomely, got annual stipend or salary or bribe, whatever you want to call it, for about 25,000 pounds, a big money in those days. And this was, it's the Amir negotiating, he's in the middle. And the guy in the topi is an Italian-British negotiator named Sir Louis Cavanari. And so they again, they pacified it. And you can see it as the history repeated itself, that they decided to stay for a little while and they shortchanged the finances because the war was becoming expensive. And finally ended up deciding that, okay, it wasn't worth occupying. So the old saying says it was easy to conquer Afghanistan, but much harder to occupy. That we have seen it time and time again. And this is, so this is a big piece in British history, the march to Kandahar. Okay, this time they spell Kandahar the way we would spell it now, not with a C, the General Roberts March to Afghanistan. So this was a piece of history. And this is when finally the borders were decided, and they it was a rather one-sided treaty that was decided with the country of Afghanistan, and starting the main object of the top class that we had agreed upon, the Durand Line, which was the dividing border between modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, that was laid out by an army man named Mortimer Durand in 1893. He was the foreign secretary under a viceroy, and he was sent on a special mission to Kabul to negotiate with these rather, Abir was fairly astute guy, so they, by the time they'd realized that, okay, well, they could be in between Russia, and Russia had finally decided that enough of trying to conquer Asia, and again, they had their own internal problems. So this is the, I'll see if I can magnify this Durand line. Okay, yeah, it works. So you can just see the color coding shows what the different populations are, type of thing. And this is the present day Baluch, okay, and the Pashtun population is in the green. So you can see that it's divided up, and this brown color is Punjabis, and this is a province called Sindh. Okay, so this is, these are the four main ethnic group of present day Pakistan: the Baluch, okay, the Punjabis, who are the rich and controlling force in present day Pakistan. This is the Pashtuns, who are scattered all over, and up there are the Tajiks, and the Hazaras are settled over here somewhere. Okay, so this is, this was the ethnic thing, and this has been still the bone of contention. And okay, all right, so okay, and then finally the Brits negotiated the treaty so much so it was in their favor. The passes that were the main port of entry to Afghanistan, they made sure that they would control them. The so-called Bolan Pass, which is in the southern part here, and Kurram Valley, which is the northwest frontier region of Pakistan, is present, and the Khyber Pass, which is the route that Alexander took. So, and at the same time, they decided that the Brits will control the foreign affairs of Afghanistan. So basically, it almost became a protectorate, just like Egypt was a few years later, or actually even, yeah, about the same time. Okay, and So this was this, and by that time, again, the British politics was changing, and with the government change, they decided, okay, they had enough of Afghanistan. So as long as they didn't cause any mischief, no, they will not meddle in their internal affairs. So, okay, and this is the area. So by that time, they wanted, this was drawn out rather cleverly by like the boundaries, because they wanted to make sure that they could stay away from uh, Russia, that they didn't directly, so obviously at that time there was no Pakistan. So they really laid out a nice narrow corridor. This is and it's still there, which became part of Afghanistan, as to how they could separate the Tajikistan separate from British India. Okay, and they gave it as a part of corridor, so there would not be any direct chance of marching along. So it's a rugged. So it was used in the old Silk Road days. This was a trading route, between the Central Asia, and again, even Marco Polo may have come this way. Various Jesuit priests crossed this into China in 1602, and again, later on, a German explorer and archaeologist named Sir Aurel Stein explored this area, and with the goods transport type thing. So this was, a big area of exploration, in the historical routes of trade, including even in the early 20th century by a guy who we'll talk about in a few minutes later, because there was still, the British India was suspicious and was sending out agents. Okay, and this is the first time that the man who is familiar to all of you makes this thing, because he wanted to make his, advance in the army. So he joined the army and was seeking action. And this was Churchill's first posting. Okay, and he had used his. Sorry, let me reject it. Okay, all right. This was, he used his mother, who was American, connection with various British military who is who, and got himself posted to India, because that was the Northwest frontier, was the romantic place where a man could win medals. And there's a book. This was, he was in competition with another, uh, upper class military man. And so he was always one step ahead. He had joined the army earlier, and he had already won some awards type of thing. So the Winston was always trying to keep up with, I forget his name, but it's well mentioned in this. This is a book that is, I've just read it recently through the library, but I didn't want to get bogged up in all the details. But those of you, so this was a nice escapade. So he's initially posted to Bangalore in South India and travels by train to Afghanistan. And, as like the military generals kind of, tolerated him because of his upper class connections. And in fact, and he did show some valor. At the same time, he took more risk than he almost came close to getting shot on the border, because he was taking some, but like a lot of 20-year-olds who were in a quick hurry to get medals, he was taking a lot more risk, that, and that's a statement from this book that said, who's that idiot in gray pony who is standing out in the front, so to speak, so, but he was very, very lucky to escape, type of thing. And this was a battle that he didn't fight in the Battle of Mewar, so he actually never caught the border, but in the Northwest frontier area, there was an uprising that occurred a few years later after the First War in the Malakand Rising. And this is the so-called troubled region of Pakistan, the Northwest frontier region. And it's still troublesome that even the Pakistani army would, go with very caution, with as long as they're well equipped, So this was the making of the frontier wall. And so this is the book, the title you may not be able to see because this is the original cover. The title was The Malakand Field Force. Okay, and the operations of the field force against Mahmud tribe from September of 1897 to October, so on the northwest frontiers of India. So that was the subtitle. Okay, And this is still, the historical Karakoram highway that is still being very much used and has been rebuilt by the Chinese and is part of the new Belt Road that extends from modern day China to this so-called Wakhan corridor, as we saw, that sticks out around here, Tajikistan, and winds around all the way to modern day Pakistan, to the, getting further down to the seaport, on the Persian Gulf. And this was the Iron Amir who he ruled, he was the grandson of Dost Muhammad, Durrani line. And he was again, just like a lot of, rulers of that time. He followed the Turkish and the Persian and the Central Asian, this thing. He really actually did mass transfer of population, against the Hazaras, and made sure that the Pashtun majority continued, and went after the Shiites. Okay. And that little area that we talked about called Kafiristan, I showed you about, the romantic novel by Rudyard Kipling. And so he forcefully converted them to Islam and remade that whole area into something called Nuristan. So he was, he was a product of his time, type of thing. So a lot of, and again, and obviously the trouble started with him appointing his successors, and that led to the war type of thing, as we talked about a few minutes ago. And so we can see how he was more Russian in outlook and training than Brit or even Afghan for that matter. So he was heavily influenced by Russian culture. Okay, and so this was, this was one of the quotes from Winston type thing on the road to Chitral. Chitral is very high up in the mountain area, so it's a very attractive vacation spot, even among the modern day Pakistanis, because it's a hilly, snowy area. And again, so, and he wisely at that time, he recognizes the Mohammedan or Islam in those days. Religion increases the fury of intolerance propagated by sword, and the emotional Pashtuns are powerless to resist, and they become Ghazis. So one has to say that for a 22-year-old, he was able to put it in the words what we are seeing at the present time. So, but enough on Winston. I mean, I'm sure, our colleague Mike Hodges has given a class on it. So if you haven't, hopefully he'll give it one day again. So I would strongly suggest, Okay, and at that time, again, there was, the Brits were not, were given, the preachers were following the military. So there were several ministers who were actually out to convert the heathens, with relatively limited success. And this one character was actually, they were trying to match the so-called soldiers of Allah by preaching the Christianity. And one interesting character is Dr. named Dr. Pinnell. Okay, he completed his MD and FRCS in 1897, offered his services to church missionary societies, and developed, again, he was sent to India, and they both started learning the Urdu, that is the native language, which is a mixture of Persian and Hindi. They're in Karachi, and they started medical work, like hospitals, but they had a very few converts, basically. Okay, and some of his writings are really kind of tells you that for his time. I shall just read a line paragraph. As I traveled, I sometimes rejoiced and sometimes was saddened. Almost every village, and I would meet a Christian and saddened that so many of them did not smell like Christians. I did not know that Christians had any particular smell, but there you have it. The missions have been the custom of baptizing various lower class people and changing them names without examining them. The results of their misdoings are a blot on Christian religion. So he had made some very good observation. He was afraid that concentrating on the lower class would deter the high caste Hindus and Muslims from coming to Christ. He felt the pressure to produce results in terms of numbers of baptized candidates was leading to a lot of superficial evangelism and slipshod practices. So he had made some very astute observation on the practice of the missionaries. Okay, and there's always, there is always fine for a nice light-hearted comedy. And I think I might have shown some of these in the class on Britain and India, but this is just as it's a riot about the British sense of humor. Carry on up the Khyber. We already talked about the Khyber Pass. So
India, 1895, the most precious gem in the far-flung belly of the great British Empire, ruled by the British governors, who, in turn, are ruled by their wives. And the Khyber Pass, frontier garrison of the 3rd Foot and Mouth Regiment, otherwise known as the Devils in Skirts.
I was only trying to keep warm.
Oh, so you're cold, are you?
Very simple. Where the wind whistles up the pass.
With a reputation of being invincible in battle, they fearlessly carry on up the Khyber. Yes, a right carry on, up the Khyber. Produced by Peter Rogers and directed by Gerald Thomas in their own ever-popular style, with your favourite carry-on characters up to their necks in the hilarious comedy that you love. Sidney James as Sir Sidney Rough Diamond, Joan Sims as his lady wife.
Oh, I see. Did not half crack that one, did he not?
Dearest, if you can't express yourself in more elegant terms, kindly shut your kegel.
Kenneth Williams as Randy Lal, the Qazi of Calabar.
May the benevolence of the god Shivu bring blessings on your house.
And on yours.
And may his radiance light up your life.
And up yours.
Roy Castle as Captain Keen.
How could you whittle?
I felt the cold, sir.
That's no excuse, man. The 3rd Foot and Mouth never wear anything under the kilt. It's part of our glorious tradition. Look at our motto. Always ready for action.
Angela Douglas as Princess Jelly.
Now go to the women's quarters and pay your respects to your mother.
Yes, ma'am. Which one is he again?
Charles Hawtrey as Private James Whittle. Bernard Breslaw as Bung Ditin of Jaxie.
Never teach them to bend turbans on the buses.
Terry Scott as Sergeant Major McNutt.
The cars is here under a flag of truce, sir. We bunged it in.
All right, Captain.
Right, Sergeant Major, show them in.
Peter Butterworth as Brother Belcher, a dedicated missionary who saves fallen women for himself. The Devils in Skirts find themselves in trouble as the tension mounts and the elastic snaps.
Cindy, get me some more, Margot. This one's a bit off.
okay, so you get some idea of the rather Benny Hill style Brit humor. Okay, all right. So in fact, and then there were always the sort of skirmishes that went up type of thing. And after crushing the Hazaras, he had made some incidences on attacking the Russian areas as well. And so he was, trying to exercise some of his independence, basically. And at the same time, a lot of the Hazaras were defeated, and there were thousands of them were sold as slaves in the markets of Kabul, and so many. So it was, he was absolutely a rather cruel and ruthless leader, a product of his time that we talked about. Okay, and at the same time, I just thought this name was rather clever, and so there were a lot of people who were doing genuine exploring, and this one guy whose name is absolutely was Riot, Francis' young husband, again, who was I don't know whether he was British Scot or British Irish, but was born in India, became a diplomat. And he was actually, one of the earlier ones when they made attempts at opening up Tibet, and managed to get a one-sided treaty with the Tibetans. And he'd also, again, he was brought up as a evangelical Christians, but at the same time, he had diversified into various other spiritual practices. He was a follower of Tolstoy at that time, and again had a vision about Tibet, that might have inspired Shangri-La stories, and about the mountains in Tibet and telepathy and the other practices, about theosophism and other stuff were coming to this. And at the same time, they had, again, the racial theories that were proposed by a guy named Gobineau and Chamberlain, and they were into vogue. And so they were strong believers, as you can believe, in the mountain Aryanism. So that was the product of his times, And so so he pressed on into Tibet with the negotiation of the 13th Lama collapsed, and then a confrontation took place in Tibet, and which again, Tibetans were fighting with bows and arrows against machine guns. So that was rather one-sided battles, and again, finally, his expedition managed to reach Lhasa, the Forbidden City, at that time. So it's an interesting character, and these are, even today, Patrick French is a recent popular British historian writer, and this is one of his works on young husband. So, I mean, last time I had a slide, Francis, young husband, what every woman wants, So, but I thought that was rather, the same humor loses its punch. So, and this is again after First World War. Afghanistan was courted by both, and again, they were opposed to, and they had the internal troubles, between the Tajik War. So, and this is a little later than I talked about in First World War, but finally Afghanistan was becoming recognized after the First War, and the Afghan king and queen, were recognized by the United States, and they made a whirlwind tour. So they quickly, from the feudal state of rooting in the traditional Mongol style, they had marched into modernity rather quickly. So, and that may have been his undoing, so to speak, was he tried to reform a very traditional Islamic society from the Middle Ages to modern times very quickly. And again, so that just backfired on him, and then almost he had to abdicate basically, and ended up reading his rest of his life in Italy or somewhere. So it was the progress between 20th century and 19th century. The struggle discontinued, and this was. And that we'll jump right into the second earlier part of the 20th century. After the First World War, the Afghans had decided, okay, well, the Brits are rather weak at that time, so let's regain the areas of that were separated from us by the Durand border. Okay, so they decided to march and try to, the new Amir of Afghanistan, the name is, he wanted to tear apart the treaty that was rather forced upon them, the Treaty of Gandamak after the Second War. Okay, and so, and they were, and again, by that time, the Bolshevik Revolution had taken place, and the Amir was leaning more towards Russia at that time. So again, so that led to the start of the Third Afghan War. And again, obviously, they didn't realize, they were fighting a big empire. And this was the first time I may have mentioned it earlier, the 19th versus 20th century war, and the Afghan mountain area was attacked by the biplanes, as you can see in this picture. And some of these things that pictures that I sent out were from the British Military Museum, and these are the individual photographs of that time. And if you click on this views, the object, you'll be able to see the whole details in its full glory. British airfield on the frontier in 1919. So the war in Europe had transferred to Asia. Now, at that time, the important event that had taken place was, as a lot of you would recall, in 1905 was the first time that the Russians lost to the Japanese. And it was the first time that an Asian country had defeated Europeans using modern warfare strategy. So this was, so again, so this was the awakening that was taking place. Okay, and so this was, and obviously that gave ideas not just to the British, but all over Southeast Asia and India. And by that time, in India had also started out with, the Indian National Congress that was formed in 1885. Just to put it in perspective, Gandhi had made his mark in South Africa with the imposition of tax on the Indian middle-class merchants that was imposed, and he had gone back to India in early 20th century. And so there were a lot of trouble going on in the subcontinent. Was the early, and again, the one guy who needs to be mentioned is Afghan foreign minister to the king, and he had styled himself after the Young Turk of of the founder of modern day Turkey. And he was a guy named Muhammad Tarzi. The name is academic. He was a journalist, author, translator, foreign minister. And again, he negotiated rather astutely with the Brits after, the treaty. And finally, the Brits decided that, okay, well, Afghanistan will be independent, after the Third War. And throughout his tenure, he was a high government official. Okay. And there, in 1921, they decided, okay, they will recognize Afghanistan as independent state. And the negotiations dragged on as a lot of them do. It's 11 months of discussions, and they signed a peace treaty normalizing this thing. So Brits actually accepted the independence of Afghanistan. And for those of you who love to know the history, there is a book written by a Canadian historian. I'm trying to think her name. I think it's Margaret Macmillan. I may be wrong, but there's a book called 1919. It talks about the treaty that was done, and as to how all the nations of the world actually came to ask for their right of self-determination with the Wilson formula. It's a fascinating story about Paris 1919. That was the name of the book. And in fact, I think in 2019, I was going to do a class on 1919, but never got around to doing it, So, okay, but it's a fascinating book as to how, and it's interestingly how badly it's dealt. India herself did not have representation at that time. India was represented by the people who were supporting of the British Empire. One was a highly educated Bengali who was Lord Sinha, and another was a prince. So India was not independently represented. So they lost their moment. And at the same time, Wilson had double minds about allowing all the other, like the lower races represent, because they had their problem with Philippines. So there was a different, but it's a fascinating history book for those of you who want to read about the Paris Treaty, about the conferences and the formation of League of Nations. Okay, and again, this gives you some insight on the Islamic fundamentalism.
Letter movement. Following a quashed uprising against the British East India Company in 1857, some Muslims started to set up seminaries in order to protect traditional Islamic values from British interference. The most successful of these was around 150 kilometers north of Delhi, in a town called Deoband, established in 1867. The ever-suspicious British Empire sent spies to infiltrate its classes, but reported nothing of interest until 1915, when evidence came to light of a change in attitude, which reached the top, including its president, Maulana Mahmud al-Hassan. A year later, Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi, a Sikh convert to Islam, had been caught with 3 silk letters in the lining of his coat. A group is to liberate India. This group has moved to establish centres in India to make alliances with other powers. Another group, called Al-Janud al-Rabbaniya, is a special Islamic assembly based on military principles. Its first object is to create an alliance amongst Islamic kings. This is the only way of inflicting an effective blow against the infidels of India. The plan was to send envoys to both Islamic powers and Britain's World War I enemies to invite them to join in the struggle against British rule. At the onset of the First World War, Maulana Ubaidullah, Maulana Mahmud al-Hassan, and other key figures of Deoband left India to seek alliances with Afghanistan, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. Letters described how Maulana Mahmud al-Hassan would be a military general with subordinates in Tehran, Kabul, and Istanbul, and eventually India itself, which Hassan later denied when captured in Mecca and interrogated in Cairo. When Maulana Ubaidullah's letters were first discovered in British-ruled Multan, they were described as childish rot by Sir Michael Francis O'Dwyer, the governor of Punjab, but the Department of Criminal Intelligence in India thought that they were much more serious. British officials produced thousands of pages of analysis, attempting to understand the significance of the letters for the future of British rule. The objects of the conspiracy to wage war, to attempt to wage war, and to abet the waging of war against the forces of His Majesty, or to dispossess His Majesty of the sovereignty of India, were to be effected by exciting religious fanaticism among the Mohammedans of India, by perverted teaching from the Quran, and in other ways by stirring up hatred against the British government among the frontier tribes in Afghanistan by seeking warlike assistance from the Turkish Empire and by collecting funds for these ends. After the discovery of the conspiracy, key Deoband figures, including Maulana Mahmud al-Hassan, were arrested and deported to Malta until the end of the First World War, the British fearing a backlash if they were to be imprisoned in India. The story of the Silk Letter movement highlights the British Empire's long history of viewing its Muslim subjects as fanatical. But India's 2013 commemorative Silk Letter movement postage stamps showcased a different view of the affair, one of celebration of the movement as part of a struggle against an oppressive regime and as a nationalist contribution to Indian independence.
It's an interesting thing, yes. So now there are various thoughts you can do that obviously this movement, this agitation that was started, it very cleverly ignores 80% of the population that was Hindu, and that was unlikely to support them. So that just, and there at that time, some of you may have taken my class on history of India. I said, okay, there were a lot of some struggles that were done by local Muslims in South India as far back as 1870s, but they were quickly suppressed type of thing. So without the support of 80% majority of Hindu population, it was highly unlikely it was going to succeed. And obviously Gandhi and some of the more Western educated leaders tried to play best of both sides and try to take the make sure that the Hindus and Muslims can stay united, and obviously we can see that in 50 years they failed miserably, leading to the partition that took place eventually. And so it's a long story, and that will go. I mean, this is not a history of India class, but well, it incorporates the whole of South Asia, so it's important to mention that. Okay, and this is again, we talked about the rise of Russo-Japanese War, Gandhi's exile government formed it. And this was an interesting character. It's amazing how much one can find on internet as to this was a Hindu prince named Raja. Obviously, it's a very Hindu name. So he managed to run up to Afghanistan and actually formed, he's in the center and surrounded by the Afghans. At that time, Afghanistan was almost becoming independent. So he formed a government in exile. And then he continued to work with Germany and Turkey. And so he decided to form a so-called government in exile, so to speak, and then returned after and became friends with Gandhi, and it was a political figure for several years and became a member of the parliament after the independence. Okay, so there were some, and at the same time, this may interest you that there was some Asian Indian migration that had taken place on the west coast of the United States, and they had actually formed a Freedom Party somewhere in San Francisco area, but the long arm of the British government or spies were extended even in the United States at that time. And they were easily able to arrest some of these people, and their plans to send arms to port of Calcutta were thwarted by the British Empire. Okay, and so that the party was still there, and obviously some of them were left-leaning and communist, which did not go well with the United States government at that time and after the end. So it just fizzled out, so to speak, but there were several attempts that were done. Okay, and nationalism surfaced in India, and this was started as the Indian National Congress, and this was after the partition of Bengal. At the same time, the Muslims were rather late in adopting to Western education, but one of the enlightened British Muslim judge who was trained in Britain had started Muslim university in northern India, and had formed a Muslim League. And he was one of the first one to propose the idea that Muslims are in minority and they cannot live in combined India. So that was the first germ of the idea of a separate nation. And it took almost 50 or 60 years, but it finally, ended up dividing the subcontinent. Okay, and then subsequently, the two characters who were the prime, this thing was obviously Gandhi on the right in Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was a more Indian in look, but and he was not as and he was, I don't think he was a Sunni Muslim in the beginning, at least, and he was a barrister, was not at all religious at that time, but then he finally realized that too. And then it was falling apart with Gandhi. There were total antitheses of each. Gandhi was dressed in native dresses and believed in non-violence. Jinnah was totally, exactly diagonally opposite of it. And then he later on realized some of the negotiations fell apart and leading to partition and a gradual separation. And the conservative government in Britain also, in the movie Gandhi that you may have seen in 1980s, by Edinburgh, I would say like how Britain wisely just or astutely played the two parties against each other, and they included even the third party of the Indian princes. Okay, and some of them were independent and they did not want anything, they wanted to be ruled by themselves. So it was a three-ring circus, and the roundtable conferences played them very astutely. Okay, and just to say, I mean, for those of you who are friends of railways, this was by that time, by 1909, there was a extensive network of railroads that was established, and from in the lower corner you can see Bombay here, and this is Karachi here, and this is the border of Peshawar right here, which I've circled. And this was a train called the Frontier Mail that even when I was in high school in this part of India and in university, this train was still in existence. It was still called the Frontier Mail because it went to the frontier. Then later on, after the falling apart of the India-Pakistan war, it stopped somewhere, in northern India and the Sikh capital of Amritsar, where I showed the Golden Temple. It was called a Frontier Mail, and it was started directly from the Bombay seaport to the railway station, and was one of the first air-conditioned train, and it's still, this was obviously the steam engines. You can see it's very romanticized, and you can see that it extended all the way to Peshawar right here in British India. So this is Afghanistan and Persia, just to give you another map. So, okay, so and now it's named something else, and again, by this time, so there was the Hindu fundamentalism was rising also by a separatist party. And again, it's two nations. So both religions were pulling further and further apart in spite of the best wishes of the more enlightened people. Okay, I think we're doing well on time. I'll take a breath, and if anybody has any questions, comment, I will interrupt myself for a few minutes. I don't see anything in the chat, so I think we're okay. All right. Okay, if not, I shall continue with my monologue. And again, so this just summarizes the history, the Muslims, and finally, with the roundtable conferences failed, and that led to further and further alienation of both communities. And what in the First World War, India and Pakistan, but there was no Pakistan at that time, they supported Britain wholeheartedly. And the name you may recognize from that brief video on Silk of the Governor General of Punjab, which is called Sir Dwyer, and he and his military person named Dyer, D-Y-E-R. They led to the massacre of a lot of people who had gathered for non-violent protest in present-day Punjab. And the Indian soldiers and people who fought in the First War had hope that they will at least get a dominion status in the subcontinent, but that did not happen. And with the fear of communist Russia and rising insurgencies, the British government imposed more sedition laws, and they fired upon people who had, were unarmed into the so-called Amritsar or Jallianwala massacre. And that led a lot of the Indian National Congress leaders to ask for total independence. And a lot of them were jailed, and it just went on and on for 30 years. Now, this may shock you type of thing, that this was actually a Pashtun activist named Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who was born in 1890s. And unlike a lot of the Muslim leaders or fighters, he was actually a follower of Gandhi, and he was nonviolent, pacifist, and he was so much so that he was admired as called the Gandhi of the frontier. Okay, and and he obviously being a Pashtun, he did not identify with the Punjabis and other, and he wanted a special Pashtun independence state in the, and he was asked even at the time of partition, asked for a referendum, but somehow by that time the Indian National Congress had enough of the Muslim, they just wanted a quick departure. So here is this picture of this Abdul Ghaffar Khan with Nehru, who was a big negotiator with Lord Louis Mountbatten. So he felt betrayed by the Indian National Congress. And so this was an interesting person. And he was still a force to be reckoned with in the modern Afghanistan. And he lived to be until 1988. So you can see that he still had some substantial influence in Afghanistan, even after the creation of Pakistan. So, and he had also formed a special party called Awami National Party. His brother was a chief minister of the Northwest Frontier Province. Okay, and then he later started with Afghanistan and with Soviet. So it was an interesting character type thing. And again, so at that time, communism had made its way into the subcontinent. You can see Khuda means God, Khidmatgar means servants, and the red shirts, so this was the Awami National Party and People's Party. So communism was absolutely a very popular uprising that took place just all over, not just in Soviet Union, but Afghanistan was not about it. And at the same time, the fundamentalism was also equally important, because you can see that this was a religious leader. Fakir means a religious leader, almost like a clergyman, basically. So this was he single-handedly declared war on the Raj, as well as the Sikhs, and asking for Pakhtunistan. And this was, so there was a lot of fundamentalist rise at the same time, communist rise. So it was a major row of conflict that was taking place. Okay, all right, and this is the so-called Mountbatten Plan, which with the countdown to hand over to the power, handed over self-government to India in 1947. Mountbatten Plan was, India was divided and was written by Cyril Redcliffe, and there was another border that is still a bone of contention. So mostly Hindu regions, and Pakistan was formed, and two dominions, East and West Pakistan. And it's interesting that at the time, not all Brits, but there were some Brits who actually had proposed, even before the start of Second World War, to recognize the Indian demand for dominion status, and saying that, well, that there could be a lot of raw material and industry that could be started, and they could become a so-called arsenal for the British Empire. But those plans were obviously, the conservative Tory government was not about to. But so there were a lot of people who realized that, that the empire was winding down, and including a lot of the Indian civil service officers who were just counting days. Well, I just want my pension and to get out of this subcontinent ruling business, because it was becoming more and more expensive, and they were seeing, a lot of people were seeing the writing on the wall, so to speak. And this was the partition that took place. This is Afghanistan still stayed, and this was the border with Pakistan, and this was two maps that were created. Okay, all right, okay, let's see, we are doing, we still have 2 or 4 minutes, so we may be done sooner than we think, And this was interesting that when Pakistan was created, let's talk briefly, a few minutes about the Kashmir controversy. And Kashmir was, originally Muslim. It was conquered by the Sikh Empire, okay, and the Sikhs ruled area. So they had Hindu rulers with Muslim population, and at the same time, when all the various princes, there was one big Islamic princely state called Nizam, who was one of the wealthiest royal houses in India, there were some other states, that did not want to join either of the government, so to speak, India or Pakistan. And some of the Indian political leaders who were almost really like Machiavelli type of people who managed to either appeal to their sense of nationalism, they bribed them, they blackmailed them, and they were able to convince almost 500 of these, lot of princely states and kingdoms and a lot of estates to join either one or the other areas. For example, this area of here called Junagadh. So it was a Muslim Nawab, but he finally chose to join with India. This is area of Amir of Sindh that joined Pakistan. Nizam stood out for a long time, and finally he wanted to fight with the Indian nation type of thing. So they did what they call tongue-in-cheek, named police action, and he finally acceded. The Maharaja of Kashmir was undecided until the last minute. In Pakistan, as I said, the word was included K for Kashmir. So they decided to send various irregular Pashtuns, or as the Pakistanis call them, Pathans, to attack Kashmir. And they marched very easily, by land into Kashmir. And when they attacked Kashmir, at the last minute, when they realized that he was in trouble, the Maharaja signed joining the newly formed nation of India. So whether who gets the right, and Prime Minister Nehru was almost believed in socialism, and he decided to take the case to the United Nations, and they agreed for plebiscite. By this time, the Pathans, who were the irregular with their old-fashioned rifles, they could have captured Kashmir, but they stopped to plunder and loot some of the cities that they had attacked. That's why the Indian army was able to airlift soldiers and repel them back. So that was a bit of controversy, and the conflict was taken to United Nations, and Nehru, being somewhat naive socialist, agreed to plebiscite, and Pakistan ended up controlling part of the Kashmir, and the United Nations decided a peacekeeping force that after 70 years it's still there. Okay, and the plebiscite has never taken place, by the way. And so this were about 1,000 Pashtun tribesmen were recruited amongst various tribes, and they were sent in September. As you can remember, the partition took place in August. So within 1 month, the Pakistani army had sent this irregulars saying, well, they're so-called, and they were expected to reach Abbottabad, which may come to, you may remember from where Osama bin Laden was hiding out in Pakistan here. And they crossed into Kashmir in October. And so they were, so this was the historical perspective on the boiling pot of Kashmir that is still there. Okay, we are coming up to 11 o'clock. I think I have only about 30 or 40 slides. So we can take a 5-minute break, stop for questions and comments, and join together in a few minutes. Okay, let's see. I think Khan is such a common surname name. Oh yes, Pashtun, Laura. That the name is Khan is, it's a Muslim name of a small estate owner, which is the Khan. Mostly it's a Pashtun or Punjabi origin. So from Islamic thing. So anybody who's like, a lord or lord of the manor, so to speak, one can answer. Okay, to answer your question. So that's why it's a called. Like a Raja would be an Indian name, so that way Khan is somebody who owns a small landowner, so to speak. It could be as small as 10 acres, or it could be thousands of acres. Okay. All right, I will stop the recording for the time being, and I'll pause the Zoom recording. I will start the recording. Okay, and this may have been, can everybody see my slide? Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, all right. Share screen, yeah. Oh yeah, we should be still sharing, yeah. Okay, I got it. Let me minimize my, no, actually I can stay with this, just move it. Yep, got it. Okay, now I can see everybody's faces in case they have any All right. Oh yeah, Kevin. Yeah, Paris by Margaret Macmillan. So Kevin was ahead of me. Thanks, Kevin. It's Paris 1999 by Macmillan. So yeah, I was right about Macmillan. So this is the legacy of colonialism as to how, the division that took place, not just in Afghanistan, but all over, the ethnic division that we're, and you can see that, I think Ephraim was looking over the map very, in more details as to how the population, the Hazaras are in the middle, the Pashtuns are divided on both sides, okay, and the Tajiks, who are more Central Asian lineages, so they are scattered over, including the province, and the few number of Uzbeks, and so and a lot of the people who fought with the Al Qaeda and other stuff, they were quite a few number of them were the Uzbeks and the Tajiks, so they were with a smattering of Europeans, thrown in. So and they were the tough fighters and some of the Arabs type of thing. So it's an interesting story, but it's a lot of stuff has been written about Al Qaeda, and then I think we won't dwell too much into it. Okay, and so these are. So even Afghan national anthem and the Afghan constitution has about 14 different tribes, like Pashtuns, Tajik, Hazaras, Uzbek, one I never even heard of called IMAQ, AIMAQ, Turkoman, Baluch, Pashai, Nuristani, Gujar, Arab, Brahui, Kilbash, Pamiri, Kyrgyz, Sadat. Wow, I mean, so there is enough nationalities to keep the pot boiling, so to speak. So, okay. And I think I mentioned this about the code of the Pashtuns, and so this is, the infamous Osama with the head of the Taliban, okay. And you can see how that he invoked the so-called code of Pashtunwali, said, well, hospitality, asylum, justice and revenge, and these are the Islamic names, so showing hospitality and respect for visitors, regardless of race, religion, national affiliation, etc. Okay, so they will go to a length to show hospitality, the protection given to person against his enemies, so trying to protect people until the situation is clarified, but at the same time to seek justice and take revenge against the wrongdoer. And there are no time limits, obviously, the revenge. Okay, so anything can be, simple revenge could be for insult, just based on words, monetary, of course, women, and so this is, and sometimes that can be settled with giving monetary compensation. So it's a different culture altogether. Okay, and after the thing, so there were, several, post-war, Afghanistan was fairly successful. As you can see, that both sides were quoting Afghanistan, so they were, getting help from both sides because they realized the importance of landlocked thing, and obviously they were caught between the two, the Russians, obviously they earlier, even before, Second World War, they had leaning towards socialism and formation of parties that I alluded to earlier, but it continued to a major extent at Khrushchev, is with the Afghan prime minister, and there was a substantial amount of aid, and the Kennedy in the southern part, United States had done their share of giving help. So here is JFK with the king. So this was, and this is the Russian stamp, USSR. Okay, you can see they had, friendship, and that was this thing. So let's see, I think so. There's a whole Wikipedia article for the long-standing relationship with Russia that was there, and obviously, to go ahead. I'm sorry.
Rod, quick question.
Yes,
I'm sorry to interrupt. The page before, when you talked about, when you mentioned justice and revenge, in the Middle East, and I'm familiar with the Arab world, not the.
Oh yeah, right.
Families' revenge against other families because of something done to a woman, or all the areas you mentioned. So there is no time limit for one family to revenge against another family, and therefore quite a few murders in the Arab world are related to that family respect, honor.
Yeah,
Keeping,
absolutely. Yeah.
is that the same thing in Afghanistan
Uh,
and
yeah, but I
Pakistan?
think there, and there's so much violence that goes. Yeah, I think to some extent, yes. I think yeah, that revenge continues to happen. So and that the tribal conflict has still continued with the various. That's why there was always difficulty for one ruler because they could never keep the tribes in line. And you're absolutely right about the Arab words, which is a lot more apparent type of thing as to, and because and there was a cartoon during the Iran-Iraq war, it's like, oh, well, they killed my uncle, 1,200 years ago. So that was, so that still continues, so to speak. So yes, I think the revenge, this thing is absolutely, the culture has continued type thing. So I haven't researched in a lot more details about that one particular aspect, but that's a big factor type of thing. And a lot of them about the petty fights that occur, between cattle and money and, type of thing. So yeah, okay. No, it's an entirely different way of life, so to speak. So they were playing both sides, type of thing. And they got some good help, I think. And then again, after this, there was another, just like we talked about Therese earlier, and post 1950, there was another a rather prominent prime minister, a chap named Nur Muhammad Taraki, and he was that he leaned a lot more towards Russia, and they got the military training. I mean, for a small country, 2.5 billion is not a small thing. So, and he tried to modernize rather quickly, basically. So there was, he, he insisted a lot of these people shave off their beard, and he tried to, impose education from top down, and was obviously out and out very communist in thought, People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, and he managed to, and okay, and then so that just kind of backfired on him type of thing, and later on there was a coup and managed to throw off the king. So communism had, now at that time, obviously they were, a lot more tolerant for education. This picture that shows about the female students in Polytechnic in mid-70s, and Afghanistan at that time was fairly westernized. You can see the picture of the record store in Kabul, which almost shocks you type of thing after what we have been told after 9/11. So I mean, this was Afghanistan type of thing, and similar thing had gone on in Iran also. Obviously, that the Shah had tried to modernize rather quickly. That led to the rise of Ayatollah, and you can see the boys and girls sitting in the class at the same time. So these are some of the pictures that shows that that was different, before. So I think these pictures are rather revealing, and again you can see that the two extreme conservatism and modern fashion went together. So I think so. By golly, this putting up pictures works actually, and you can see how the traditional labor force with the women dressed in the European style, okay, and followed by that there was another prime minister, and he was at that time, he wanted to recapture the area that was under Pakistan, and this was news to me that there was actually a border clash. They were all Islamic, but in as early as 1960, okay, and he was a cousin of the king, okay. He was educated in France, and there was also a military head, Then he again, under his regime, he decided to purge the communists in the government, and at the same time trying to be progressive, he displeased the religious conservatives also, okay. So, and he was again almost like a dictator in the sense type of thing, And the Pakistani army was a lot more powerful than the Afghans, and they used their phantom jets, and the Afghans had to, there were several losses that took place, and so they did not go too far with the border war. And again, the ethnic minorities resented that he showed favoritism to the Pashtuns. So again, and he was assassinated in 1978, leading to the rise of communist parties. And by that time, the universities were a hotbed of communist influence. And so that was, again, not going well with the rural areas. So the politics that we saw in a lot of other countries had played a big role as well there. Okay. And so this was the border clash that, for the Pashtun land that took place, on border war in the 60s, okay, that we just talked about. Excuse me. Okay, mouse. Okay. All right. And obviously, it's growing up in the 60s, this is worth playing.
In the ranks, there were definitely working class people from the suburbs of London, from council houses, people who didn't have much money, people who'd never travelled abroad before. And again, I think that's true generally about hippies. You might want to say the origins of hippie culture are clearly middle class, but it was permeable. And then there were plenty of working class people saying, I like the look of that. And there weren't barriers, they could float over into hippie culture, they could float over into the hippie trail. The sort of master writer here is, I think, Jack Kerouac and On the Road, which I don't think is so popular any longer now. At least I don't get the impression it is. But and there's many things wrong with that book. I don't want to sound like Brian and myself that this book is the Bible or something, but Kerouac was the one who said, this is a new way of travelling. Travelling in itself can be a valid, liberatory, enjoyable experience. It doesn't have to be simply a practical route from A to B. The cameras on the hippie trail were a little bit controversial. There were some people, if you like the purists, saying you're meant to have got away from all of that. Taking a camera is like being a tourist. You're meant to just be absorbing things and taking them in, and in fact the camera is more sort of barrier than an aid to understanding. We found that quite a few people were taking cameras, and even better, some people were taking really good cameras, and the reproductions are still clear and sharp. What we were trying to do in those pictures, in a way, was trace out the journey from beginning to end, So we do start off with pictures of people packing their Land Rover. We do start off, I really like it actually, it's a sort of really dull picture of this coach in a London street, and you think, well, there's nothing exciting at all about this, but you have to think somebody thought it was worth photographing, and that's how it begins, in a very sort of grey London street. So the idea vaguely was to try and trace a typical journey, if you like, from beginning to end, the sort of things that people might have seen along the way. And in particular, we wanted to get a few pictures of interactions, because that was always very important. These weren't tourists, these were travellers, and the things that make travellers different is they interact with the local people, they meet them and talk to them, and ideally at least they meet and talk to them in with an ethic of equality, not with one side being superior to another, but these are just sort of people mixing. So we wanted to get a few pictures like that. If there, another permanent change that can be dated back to that is a new idea of travelling, and travelling not as a practical thing of, what's the quickest route to get from here to Madrid, but traveling in a way of let's enjoy the experience, let's take it slow, let's throw in chance and randomness into it, and let's enjoy that. Let's enjoy meeting people as we go along the way. Those sort of things, I think, again, have stayed with us. So yeah, we could give the Hippie Trail some credit for that as well. Could you do the Hippie Trail again today? And I don't think you could ever get that same sense of excitement, because once you'd left from Dover, you just have to think, no mobile phones, no internet, no Skype, communication by letters mostly. It was possible to phone back home, but that was really difficult. Very little in the way of hard information as well. I mean, there were some travel guides.
Okay, so I think it just goes on for long. So I'll send it because it's another half, this thing. So we still have 30 or 40 more slides. So I will, but you get the idea that I'm sure that, I don't know if any of you have personal experience. If so, jump in, by the way, of being a hippie or traveling through Europe, okay, by land. But in the class that Kevin and I did on 1967-68, we had a lot more details about it, so it was one of the fun classes to do about, and still some of the hippies have still settled in Goa, which is in south of Bombay, and it's still there, so I mean, these are people are of our age now, and they have decided to stay there on the beach because the cost of living is cheap, the weather is good, and it's a Portuguese colony, so English language was, very easy to communicate. Okay. And so these are some of the pictures, as you can see from the hippie trail. So let's see if we can zoom in that thing. And that day it was safe to travel from. And there's a bus that started from London to Calcutta. I mean, I would have loved to take that bus, but I think I was too much of a goody two shoes to do that, Okay. And focus. So you can see why Istanbul, and if you remember the movie Midnight Express, at that time Tehran was fairly liberal, and then through Herat and Kabul, Peshawar, Lahore, Delhi, and ended up in Goa, and finally the recent tourist Mecca, Bangkok. Okay, I'm sorry, and the other pictures are, and so these are some of the other pictures of Indian hippie culture remnants, so to speak, and so then there again, then there was a whole chaos that took place after communist reform. And at that time, one of the US ambassador was kidnapped, which was an interesting, I wasn't aware of that. And that was the full, and that time the Afghans actually requested the Communist Party that was in power. There were two parties that were in power. They actually asked the Russians to help, so to speak. And the Russians the Kremlin initially refused, and in fact, this was eye-opening to me. The Soviet Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin told Tareki, who we saw earlier in March of '79, the entry of our troops in Afghanistan would outrage the international community, triggering a string of extremely negative consequences. So that was, so the Russians were lukewarm about it, but they eventually, I think the more hawkish element succeeded, and they finally decided to intervene. And that's another story which will continue. So the quick reforms. So the Turkey had appealed to Kremlin for intervention to shore up his regime, so to speak, earlier. So, and again, didn't realize that the U.S. ambassador was kidnapped, and you can see that the Russians invaded with the style as to see. I mean, obviously with air power and 2 or 3 different areas that they came through. So this was one arrows. And so it was a well-organized invasion that took place. Oh, sorry. And this was the, so obviously the strategic arms talks took place in '79. And at that time, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's a Carter advisor, authorized a small covert action to provide aid to the quote-unquote Mujahideen guerrillas challenging the central government. And then the Secretary of Vance, who was had a different frame of mind. He contended that the Soviet gamble was actually weakness and let them stew in their own problems. So, but there were two different views of the security advisor and at the same time the Secretary of State. And so Carter had sided initially with Vance, but then later on started listening to the security advisor, who was the Zivnik. And so that just got started. And this was a book that I read a long time ago by Steve Cole about the secret history. And that was kind of a little dated, and this was before bin Laden capture. But he's a old hand, and it's a very well-written book for those of you who really want to know more about it. So, and that led to the protest and withdrawal. Okay, and obviously, just to stand true to the truth. Okay, I mean, I cannot let Kevin down. That none of my talks are complete unless I include Monty Python. So here is okay, so that's enough of nonsense, but that just shows my weird synapses. And we alluded to Charlie Wilson's War, and I'm sure quite a few have seen the movie, starring Julia Roberts and Tom Hanks playing Charlie Wilson, and it's quite accurate, I'm sure, to the extent because Hollywood does a great job. So, and this was, they appeared to the evangelical members of the Congress, and then the next is another history. So that people who are fighting with Second World War relics, they got their hold on Stinger missiles, and then the Russian helicopters started falling out of sky, type of thing. And at that time, this was in the movie. There is a scene where the Pakistani Prime Minister Zia-ul-Mulk, he derisively dismissed the U.S. aid of $500 million as mere peanuts, type of thing. So it was, and so U.S. poured a lot of money, and the Pakistanis were better educated, better military organized, and they insisted that all their aids should be funneled through Pakistani army, which is the security agency ISI. And I'm sure a lot of people got very rich and bought huge estates in United Arab Emirates, based on U.S. money. So that's another chapter type thing as to how, and including, the more recent incarnation of Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, and not Benazir Bhutto, who was the prime minister, but her husband had amassed a fortune based on siphoning off the money that was given as aid, as military aid, as well as the fighting and allowing passage to the Afghans. And obviously, as we very well know, that and at the same time, the Saudi money was pouring in, and that all just ended up backfiring on them. Okay, right. And so these were some of the fights that were going on in the so-called Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. So between the urban control, modern weapons, air power. This was the Russian thing. So this was one side versus the Mujahideen, Pakistan and China. And so it was like, urban versus rural. And as we know from geography history, that 80% of Afghanistan was hilly terrain, ambush and raid, and the refugees and the Stinger missiles made a huge difference. And again, at that time, the Western arm merchants were not, they were not exactly straightforward. So when the arms suppliers, they gave up their old weapons, they were like becoming kind of like a dumping ground, to do the war. So it was an interesting mix of arm merchants as from Europe, and some of the weapons they were given were out of date and not state of the art. At the same time, some of the U.S. weapons were state of the art. And this was the rise of the so-called Lion of Panjshir Valley. That was the Masood Sharif. And at that time, so they were able to knock down a huge number of Russian aircraft. And okay, and so the aid, which was $30 million in 1980, rose to $670 million in next 7 years. So that, and the the Russians were also spending huge amount of manpower as well as cost. So we ended up, and finally, so that's when finally the Russians decided that enough of it in, after 10 years, so they, okay, and we'll get around to after the Afghan coup, the Soviet military invaded to prop up the regime, and that put in like puppet government, and obviously the war was, I'm sure we have lived through some of that, so we're well familiar with it. And at the same time, the people who suffered were the local civilians, that during the Soviet occupation, as many as 1 million civilians are suspected to have died. At the same time, the Soviet loss was 15,000 Soviet soldiers. So both sides paid. And this was, I think, for, I don't know if this link will open or not. Okay. Yeah, it does open, by the way. So I will stop my share and start a new share. If I can figure out all my. No, I'm sorry, I can't get easily the share part again. So.
Our screen says it's only Thursdays from 10 to 2 and Fridays at 10 a.m. Does that make any difference?
Oh yeah, I will share a new share, share screen. Okay, let's do it this way. So. Okay, just a second. Yeah, I think I've got it now. Sorry, I was, Okay, yeah, you should be able to see now. Can you see it now? Okay, you should be able to see the share now. Okay. Now? Okay, can you hear me? Okay, all right, yeah. So let me start. Share screen, okay. Yeah, just a second. I think I'll set up slideshow. Yeah, I'll go back to my slide, because this is trying to show that link does not work very well. So. Okay, yeah, you should be able to see that slide now. You can see the slide now? Okay, good. All right, yeah, so it was, trying to show the link is not that straightforward. So, okay, presenter view. I will get my. Okay, yeah, we should be in business now. Okay, so then, so by the time with the Soviet invasion, millions of Afghans started fleeing into neighbors Pakistan. Okay, and again, as we saw that, so there was a huge humanitarian crisis. You can see from the picture that these are the refugees in camps near Peshawar in 1980s. So a whole generation that grew up. And again, I thought this was an amazing picture. You would not have guessed this. These fundamentalist fighters, they're there at the White House with Reagan. Okay, so this was a picture that I picked up from Wikipedia from 1983. So it was interesting how the politics, and this were the picture of the Stinger missiles, allowing them to shoot down the helicopters. Okay, and then again, so that Karmal, who had invited the Soviet, he was replaced by another groomed by Soviet, a guy named Najibullah, and Kabul was largely spared during the Soviet war. Okay, but again, so there were three-ring circus that was going on, and there was a rather strong religious fundamentalist leader named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, and he was rather brutal and cruel, but was a tough fighter. And so they finally attacked Kabul, and the city was left in rubble. The National Museum was looted, and as many as 50,000 people were killed when the warlords marched into Kabul. Okay, and these are some of the pictures that you can see that this were presidential palace was damaged, by the war that went on by Hekmatyar. Okay, and finally, Geneva Peace Accord was signed between Afghanistan, Soviet Union, US, Pakistan, and the Soviet forces started withdrawing. Okay, and then this was following that in the collapse of Soviet Union. There was no support left for the communist government of Najibullah, and he took refuge in the United Nations compound, and where he remained there for quite a while. And finally, when the Mujahideen leaders entered the capital, and they started infighting, and he was killed during that uprising that took place. And these are some of the pictures of 1995, the war that just went on. And the Taliban warriors emerged successful. And by this time, a whole generation had trained in the religious seminaries in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And they took over the more conservative city of Kandahar, and to a promise to restore order and bring security. And again, they quickly imposed their harsh interpretation in the areas that they controlled. And this was when Osama made it, into Pakistan and self-funded. And he arrived in Afghanistan after he was expelled from Sudan, and eventually ingratiated himself with the mullah, Muhammad Amir. And he had given some regional fight with the so-called Afghan Arabs. But when you read more about it, he was not exactly shown himself as a big leader, and he was not, he claimed himself he was fighting his own war, but again, it was a very small portion, that part that he actually played. The more of the war was fought by the other Mujahideen, who were well funded by the Pakistani army. And this was I just put in the slide yesterday that this was what the Navy SEALs discovered, and this was a riot as to shows the inside of the man, the most well-known terrorist, as to how he was successful in carefree guarding his emails. And there are some very erudite book written by scholars, and maintained his own diary, and the picture of his wedding videos, video games, Disney films, and some porns for a good measure. And his libraries, included various thinking, including some writings by Noam Chomsky, Voltaire, and other people. So he was educated in France. So he was, and some documentaries. And finally, obviously, we've all lived through his capture type of thing. And when this is a photograph of the Taliban takeover of Kabul, and he was killed, and his body of Najibullah, the communist leader, was hung from the lamppost in the glorious Afghan tradition. Okay, and again, so this was, very quickly they imposed their control. Okay, forbidding most women from working, education was abolished, beating and amputation. And just for sake of propriety, I didn't push the put the video of the stoning of the women. It was just too horrible to watch, type of thing. And initially, only 3 countries recognized Taliban the first time around: Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates. And the United Security Council imposed terrorist sanctions on Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And just as a side measure, an Indian airline passenger jet bound from Kathmandu to New Delhi was hijacked to Kandahar, and then decided to. And by that time, some terrorists who were in Kashmir were freed and handed over to the hijackers in exchange for the passenger safety. So the whole area was closely tied in with the terrorism. And I mean, obviously, we showed this picture earlier about the blowing up and rejecting international pleas. They blew up the colossal Buddha statues. Okay, they were saying they were idol worship prohibited under Islam. And then, just as a timeline, they put some group of Western aid workers on trial, accusing them of preaching Christianity. And there were some American women in there also. And early in September, the Northern Alliance leader, Ahmad Shah Massoud, was assassinated in September 9th by Al-Qaeda leaders posing as a TV journalist, followed by 9/11. Okay, and obviously we know the history about refusal to lead. And this was the US-backed Northern Alliance entered Kabul on November 13. Taliban flee south. Regime was overthrown. Hamid Karzai was named the interim president rather, and the Bonn Accord was signed. And some of the warlords were still given powers as provisional governors, military commanders. So the people who were, part of the invasion. So the Security Alliance was established under the UN mandate. So and this is just the timeline that I have put in as a slide. So, okay. And the NATO announces withdrawal of foreign combat troop and transfer authority to Afghan forces by the end of 2014. They take over security operations. Obama administration announced plan for peace talk with Taliban. After a disputed election, Ashraf Ghani succeeded Karzai, and his rival was named as chief executive. Okay. And Donald Trump appoints U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad, as his representative. And Ghani was elected president and in 2020, leading to and this is our current president, and at the National Cemetery of the Afghan War. Okay. And so this was Biden announced withdrawal. And I think I talked it earlier, that the nice article in the current Atlantic magazine about the betrayal, about the last few days, which maybe it's a long article, but it may be of interest as a human interest story about. Now, one thing we learned that there were women who actually fought side to side with the Green Beret. So that was news to me. And those were like 18-year-olds, and they were desperate to get out because they would have been, obviously, if they were caught, they would have been killed. And some of them did get out by individual efforts of people who became friends with them. So it's and this was the story about Rory Stewart, the British traveler, writer, soldier, politician. And he had actually in 2000, he had walked from Iran to Nepal and has formed and these are some of his books, The Places in Between. So it's a fascinating travel story about an adventurous traveler. And these were the 3 characters, that I found, a guy named Dostum, Masood, and Hekmatyar. So these are some of their details about their background and what they did or they did not do. And Masood was the most able leader and fighter. So, but I think, some of the text, sorry, it will not be, you'll have to zoom it yourself because once I try to magnify it, the details are lost. Okay, but these were the 3 main characters, who actually were the big characters in overthrow of the Soviets. Okay. And last but not the least, finally after the end of Pakistan, because of their own Taliban, they have had enough problem with their own local death in the Northwest Frontier Province and Pastunwala. So they finally decided to put a border fence, just like what Trump was trying to do with Mexico, about this whole 1,600 miles or 2,500 kilometers. And that's 99, almost 100% complete now. And these are the Pakistani soldiers inspecting the border. And this was a big port for smuggling of not only goods, but opium and heroin. So this was one of the big source of income for the Taliban. And for a while, they had blocked the border, and finally they've decided to put up a big fence. And it seems there are some other videos that shows that finally the Pakistani government is making some attempt at investing in this Northwest Frontier Province, because even though they were like 17% of the Pakistan population, they were really very backward compared to the eastern part, which is Punjab and Sindh and Karachi, of course. So they are trying to increase education for girls and other things. So they're making some definite attempts at investing in that border province, which was okay. And we showed about the colorful character of Pakistan, who was born in a rich family in Lahore, even though his Pashtun ancestry, and went to the public schools or private schools, as you would call it. They were started in the British era, and went to Oxford and has a degree in economics and politics, and was played for Oxford for a while in county cricket, and then played for Pakistan, and was married to a rich. And now this is interesting. The Wikipedia articles does not mention a word about his marriage to a rich British woman, and he was married for almost 12 years. And the Wikipedia article just glosses over the details of his marriage and his Playboy days, so Wikipedia is not about, trying to clean up the act. And it goes on and on about his game records, but does not show anything about his personal life. So I almost had to chuckle. So, because I knew about it, about the history. So, and then he started to get into politics in the late 90s and ended up forming his own party. And with the corruption that was started, with the prime minister. And Pakistan, as you may know, has gone through various military regimes starting in the 1960s. That was the best era with a general called General Ayub Khan, and who either or his associate were implicated in the scandal with the which caused the downfall of the British government. Some of you who have long memories may remember, named Christine Keeler. And she was associated with one of the British ministers, and Profumo led to the downfall of one of the British governments at that in the early 60s. So General Ayub Khan was implicated, or one of his things. So that goes back to 50 years ago. So, but that follows by, the other generals who took over, and Zia ul Mulk, who decided to make Pakistan Islamic Republic and gave even much more to rise to the fundamentalist this thing. And Musharraf was actually threatened by Bush as to either you're with us or against us, and he smartly played the both sides, and and supported the Taliban as well as and as well as the Americans, and that became the in between. And it was an expensive this thing as to for transfer of one truck from Karachi to the Pakistan border. The US paid as much as $10,000 in protection money. So a lot of people got very rich quickly while during the war. And so the never-ending religious and ethnic war has still continued. Excuse me. Yeah, hello. Oh, I'm sorry. Scam call. And so this was, reports of the tentative army for militants Pakistan out. This is the Taliban in Pakistan, the Heritage Taliban of Pakistan. So they are trying to bring them to more normal routes. That time will tell as to how successful they will be. Okay. And at the same time, Pakistani Taliban declares end to ceasefire. So how the whole scenario will play out. And I mentioned earlier that there's a huge number of Pashtuns in India, as many as 3 to 10 million from 11th century onwards, and they are playing a big role, including one of the earlier presidents of Indian Republic was Pashtun origin, a guy named Zakir Hussain. And, so various, they're prominent in various spheres. So the cultural union just has continued. Okay, folks, I think that was my last slide, and we will end our session, and we're on time for once. And I will stop the recording if I can find it. And I'll see you folks next time, and I'll send out the recording